Hey everybody, it's Scott from Oakridge. This is our last Monday Life Minute videos on the book of Romans chapter 12. Last week we looked at verses 9 and 10. I would encourage you to read verses 11 through 13. Again, there's a number of statements that Paul notes regarding how we're to live and how we're to treat each other. But we're going to jump down to verse 14. We said last week one of the most difficult things to do sometimes is to genuinely show the love of Christ to others, especially when you're around somebody who's really not easy to deal with, difficult people, if we could say. Well, in verse 14 through the end of the chapter, Paul dives, I think, even into a little bit more detail about how we are to be towards people who may not treat us very well. And it could be simply because you're a Christian, or for whatever reason, they just don't like us. And I think what Paul says in verse 14, where he writes this, bless those who persecute you, bless and do not curse them. He harkens back to the words of Jesus in Matthew 5, where Christ said regarding those who would be considered our enemies, that we were to bless them. And the word bless means to wish them well or to do good for them, to bless them and to pray for them. And so Paul is telling us here that regardless of how people treat us, we don't want to respond in the same way. We might have to forgive them. And this doesn't mean that we act as doormats. We might have to separate ourselves from them because of just the destructiveness of what is going on. But it means that we take the high road in how we respond. In other words, we do things the right way. And so when Paul says, bless those who persecute you, one of the hardest things to do is to tell somebody, you know what, I hope you have a great day. Even if they're being, for lack of a better term, jerks to us. It's about our response. We never know how Christ could use us to touch someone's life. In verse 15, and he continues, we rejoice with those who rejoice, weep with those who weep. Let's be honest. I think it's easier when someone is going through a difficult time to relate to them, to interact with them, to show compassion to them. It seems to be easier to mourn with those who mourn. We're not jealous, we're not envious because they're going through a difficult time. The hardest part of that verse is what? It is rejoicing with those who rejoice. In other words, it's being happy when someone does receive a commendation that we didn't receive. It is just being gracious and not envious and not jealous when things happen in someone else's life that are good. Because sometimes you might be thinking that you're in the middle of a valley in your life and people around you around us are having things going well for them. You know what? We need to be thankful that things are good in their lives. We need to just rejoice with them. And that is a challenge. And the only way you can do this is to renew our minds. As Romans 12:2, as God's truths are changing the way we think, that is the only way we can do this. So it takes the renewal of the mind. Another important thing that Paul points out in this part of Romans 12 is found in verse 16. He says, live in harmony with one another. So try to get along. And then he says, another warning about arrogancy. He says, don't be haughty. Associate with the lowly. There are people that we encounter that constantly look down on others. It's not always about the rich and the poor. It can be about somebody who just thinks very highly of themselves and everyone else around them is, in their mind doesn't quite measure up. And if you're in a church, we should never act as if someone should not be in our church. I'll tell you why, because in all honesty, none of us deserve as Christians what we have, that relationship with God. We've all been shown God's grace. We've all been shown God's mercy. And basically verse 16 is telling us not to snub others. We don't have to see eye to eye, as we mentioned last week, about getting along with everybody in church. But what we agree on are basic beliefs. And we're going in the same direction as a church or an organization. And we set aside our differences, we set aside opinions to work together. Verse 16 is a reminder to treat people as Jesus did. Don't try to build our own image based on who we spend time with or who we talk to try to make ourselves look that we're really important, and don't push people aside who we maybe think are, quote, less than us. Paul says there's no place for that. And then he finishes in verses 17 through 21 by talking about repaying no one evil for evil, but give thought to do what is honorable in the sight of all, if possible. So far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. Never avenge ourselves. Leave vengeance to God, for I will repay, says the Lord. And he says, instead, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him something to drink. Don't overcome evil. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. And that's portions of those verses. What Paul finishes up here and tells us in this part of Romans is that when we're wronged, we are not to try to get even, to not seek vengeance. Let's be honest, when someone hurts us, often the first thing that comes to our mind is we want to get back at them. Paul says that we have a responsibility that as much as possible, we're to live at peace with people. Now, that doesn't mean that we put ourselves in harm's way, and it doesn't mean we never speak up or stand for the truth. I've discovered there's a lot of misinformation out there about Christianity and other things, and sometimes that misinformation leads to people treating people poorly, and we have to stand up and say, that's wrong. But even in doing that, I'm not doing it to get back at that person or to seek revenge on them. We're trying to clear things up. In other words, we're not to look for opportunities to get back at someone when wronged. Just take the high road. Live at peace with others according to the best of our abilities. Don't go looking for trouble. Leave everything in the hands of God. It's hard. When you've been lied about, there may be a time when you have to straighten out information. But sometimes people will say things that it's better not to say anything, but to show by how we live and how we react how wrong it was, the lies that were said. There's no clear-cut time when we speak up and when we don't. The Bible doesn't say, okay, in these 5 situations, say something, and in these, don't say anything. All I know from Romans 12 is that I need to watch myself, because it's so easy when someone has wronged us for bitterness to get a hold of us and anger, and pretty soon we're wanting to get back at the person. Instead, leave the situation in God's hands and kill them with kindness. Pray for them. Boy, that's a tough one. Always remember, God knows when we've been mistreated, lied about, or hurt. I must always remember that God knows what's going on, and in His time and in His way, He will deal with the situation. And it's not going to be on my timetable, it's on His. That's what Paul's telling us. Can I say this? Leave it all at the cross, at the empty tomb. Just be the person Christ wants us to be. And it will make a difference. We won't be eaten up all the time by what someone thinks or what someone does. Let's just respond Christ-like and let God use that to convict the other person, or let God use that in His way as He wants to use how we respond for His glory. Hey, this is Scott from Oakridge. I hope Romans 12 has given you some practical insights on living the Christian life. And thanks for joining us. We'll talk to you soon.